All right, hello everyone. Since we can't do this in person, I thought I would annotate the PowerPoint that I would typically use as a guide for my discussion with you guys. So let's delve into what does happen when we rock the power of paper, scissors, glue, and a pencil. The first material that I want us to concentrate on is copy paper. And that was a supply that I knew that my students had readily available to them. And even at our own schools, we know that typically we all have copiers, and that's pretty much the most plentiful type of paper that is around. There are some drawbacks, however, with copy paper. It is flimsy, and you can only really use certain types of mediums with it. For example, it's too thin to use pretty much any type of paint or watercolor, but because it really warps the paper. But there are some benefits to it, and I'm going to kind of share with you what I discovered. The first is that, yes, you can draw on copy paper. But after a while, I was thinking to myself, my students will probably get very bored with drawing every single assignment on a piece of copy paper. So I started to think of how can I alter or change the copy paper to be something a little bit more exciting as a medium that my students would be engaged with and like to create with. So the first thing I'm going to draw your attention to is books. There is an art teacher that I follow on Instagram. Her name is Laura Lee Chambers at 2R Chambers, and in the past I had seen she does some really creative, cute zines with her students, and that had been floating around in the back of my mind, and I thought, oh, zines are a really easy book that I could have my students create to with a variety of different art prompts or lessons. And then it also, once I started thinking about zines, it jogged my memory, and I realized that I had a book in my art teaching library, and it's called Making Handmade Books. And so I pulled this book out, and I hadn't looked at it for a while, in several years. And it was a wealth of information for me as far as creating other types of books with my students. And so I'm going to kind of show you a little bit about that book today and how that inspired me with art making in my students. And the nice thing is that the copy paper was a good option to create books with this resource. There's also another resource that I came across in my exploration, and it's a website. It's called Bookmaking with Kids, and this also had some really cool ideas. And if we pop down to the next point on the slide is cards. And I don't mean cards in the sense of like greeting cards, but what happens if we fold the copy paper somewhat in half, like a card? And when you do that, it allows you to create some type of pop-ups. And like I just held up with this other resource, another fun thing is you can create mouth pop-up books, and that's a really fun thing to do with your students. If we pop over to the other side of the presentation, some other fun things you can do with copy paper is origami, and not even necessarily traditional origami, but one thing that I was able to do with my students was to fold different variations of origami houses, and that was really fun. And another prompt or lesson I did was my students created an origami pencil in response to reading The Pencil by Alan Alberg. And then the last little thing over on the right-hand side is I have the word springs. And I'm sure this is nothing new under the sun. This is something that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. But this also came to mind when I was thinking about new and different things that my students could do with the copy paper. And I like using the spring because it allowed my students to create things that had movement. So if I attached a frog or a flower or even a butterfly to this, if my students created those types of things, it allowed it to be a little bit more exciting. It created movement. And these can also be used. I know it's pretty common that people use these little springs for legs or for arms for different particular sculptures. The other thing I just wanted to address too, in relation to the copy paper's flimsiness, is that one of the ways I found to combat that was to double the paper up. So that's where the glue came in, where I would often fold a piece of copy paper in half, but I would sort of liberally put glue in the middle of it, fold it over, and then once that dries, the paper is a lot stiffer and it allows you to do a little bit more things with it. And also, in some cases, I would take the copy paper and have my students glue it to a piece of cereal cardboard or cracker cardboard, and that also helped to combat the flimsiness of the copy paper. So now I'm going to switch over to video and sort of show you live what some of these things are that I just went over in the PowerPoint. All right, guys. Here are a couple of things that I'd like to show you that I was referring to. This was a simple folded house that is able to be created out of just a piece of copy paper. And again, I just used pencil to begin my decorations on it to show my students. And then the nice thing is the house opens up, and then my students also drew what was going on inside the house. But this was just a fun, rather than just say to kids, draw your house, this was a more interactive way for them to use copy paper to show what was happening at their house. This also is another house, a folded origami house that I have done this in the past with my students when I taught in the city of Pittsburgh, but I used this also with my students during COVID, a different grade level. And this is another house, but the cool thing about this house is you can show what's going on inside the house, but also if you take the flaps and sort of fold them out, the house then becomes three-dimensional, which is also kind of cool. And last but not least, this house was kind of interesting because it is just copy paper folded, and the parts all come, so it's just three sheets. This is from one sheet. This is one part. This is the second part, and then this is the roof. So again, all just folded and then slipped together. And the final, this was just an example of a design that I created for my students, and it was just for the elements of art. And they then went ahead and drew examples for this. But a design is essentially just a piece of 8.5 by 11 paper, and it is folded into eighths, and then all you do is make one cut from here to there, and then you sort of hold it like this, go like this, and then it kind of folds together like that. But as I mentioned, Two Art Chambers has a lot of really cool ideas. She does examples where she does she takes some of Peter Reynolds' books and draws little prompts with her kids, and they're really cute too. So hope that inspires you a little bit with the paper and the folding. And now we're going to take a look at some more examples with what you can do with scissors. So as I pushed the limits with the copy paper, and I saw that folding it in many different ways was beneficial and helped me to create a lot of new and different things, I came across the need to use scissors. And then I started to think about, well, how could I get the optimum use out of scissors? How could I push the limits of the copy paper in combination with the scissors? And some of the things I found with scissors was that, hey, I could create shapes that have a tab that I could use, that I could fold, and I could create flaps with. So I could have my students create an interactive piece of artwork. um, pop-ups that I mentioned earlier. Well, folding the paper allowed me to begin to create the pop-ups, but I needed the scissors to actually make the cuts in the paper to create the pop-ups. Um, Shapes in general, the scissors allowed me to have my students create to cut out different shapes, which was useful when we created some of our projects. And lastly, another fun thing was utilizing the ability to create fringe with the scissors. So a lot of times if you fold a piece of copy paper in half, then by making just close little cuts along that fold, you're able to create fringe, which my students and I used to create not only a sort of a roof, sort of a thatched roof for a project we did, but also to create the centers of some 3D flowers that we also created. So that's how I pushed the limit with scissors. And now I'm going to switch over to video to give you some more visual examples of what this looked like. All right, guys, I want to show you a few examples from the scissor slide that I referenced. This was a flap project that I did with my younger students talking about their houses, and I also gave them different shapes to cut out and that they could use to decorate their house, or they used these circles either in the house or to create flowers outside of the house. But this was just another way to think about cutting out different shapes, and maybe the lifting the flaps maybe inspires you in a different way with your students. This was a flower project I did with my students, and this is a template of circles that they could print out, or if they didn't have a printer, they could also just draw circle lids or things around the house to create the circle template. And this is the fringe that I was referencing that we created by just folding up the circles and then making the cuts and then opening it back up and then layering those. That was how we used the fringe there. And then we also created fringe by folding thinner strips in half, fringing them, and then rolling them back up to create these interesting centers of these flowers. And this was also a different kind of pop-up, cutting out these shapes. I had a butterfly book, and so I studied how the pop-up mechanism was created, and then I created a template for my students to cut out. And then this was, if they drew a butterfly, that would then pop up out of the paper. Rather than just saying, draw a butterfly, this was a sort of a more interactive way for them to understand symmetry in this case. And then we also did a little bit of exploration about homes around the world, and this was a Nindabel house roof, and what the students did was cut rectangles, fringe them, and then layer them and glue them around of a circle that we just cut a slit in, and then they glued it like this. So this was the roof, and then this was the roof, and then this was the base of the house, and then they could glue this here, and then the roof went on top of the house. So that was another way we utilized fringe. And then this was just another easy, quick cut of the paper, fold and then cut of the paper. These were the mouth books that I referenced, and these are really fun because then students can obviously create different animals, characters, or people that might talk. So I hope that was useful, and I hope that these projects might inspire you and give you further ideas as well. So now we've made it to the glue. And the glue is really, the glue stick was something that I hoped that my students had. And it was something that was important because it allowed us to attach things to one another. And so on this slide, I have the benefits of the glue stick were that we could attach shapes, we could attach flaps, we could strengthen the paper by gluing paper to paper or paper to cardboard, a stiffer surface. It allowed us to create more things. But it's interesting, there was really no innovative way that I really thought about using glue other than that it was useful for me to be innovative. It allowed me to be innovative with the other materials. So, sorry, glue, you're not quite as exciting as the others. All right, I just wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about how I use the glue to reinforce the flimsiness of the paper. So for example, my students, we did sort of for Mother's Day, they did this really cool pop-up card. And so I just took a piece of paper and cut a few slits in it to make the pop-up. But as you can see, the paper is really kind of flimsy and it doesn't stand up. But the cool thing is what I did is if students took an extra piece of paper, folded it in half, and then I would teach them to outline with a glue stick and then just swipe. And then same over here, outline. And then swipe. And then we'll just line up the folds and the edges. Just pop these out a little bit and then fold it, smooth it. Then you have a much sturdier piece of paper. So doubling up was something that kind of saved our dilemma of having the copy paper be thin. And another thing I wanted to show you too was what we did was sometimes we would take a strip of paper and we would put glue onto that strip of paper, and then I would have my students fold the paper, just follow the edge, all the way down. And there's one, and then I'm going to do the second one. And then, for example, when we created the springs, if we used the doubled up paper, so we would create the right angle and then when the students would do the folding back and forth and back and forth, this created a much sturdier spring than if they just did it with one layer of one thickness of copy paper. So just to give you guys an idea that sometimes this helped create a spring that was a lot sturdier for the students. And then last but not least, when we made our flowers, for example, we wanted to have, I was assuming that the students didn't have any other type of things like a pipe cleaner or a wooden skewer at their house. So I wanted to kind of make a sort of a stick out of the paper. So what we did was we folded it in half, and then we folded the paper in half again. And it's a little bit thicker, but then we did it one more time. So swipe the glue down there and then folded. And then when this dries, it is amazingly strong. So it made a really nice stem. as you can see from these flowers, it created a really rigid, sort of almost like a faux popsicle stick or something of that nature. So I hope these glue explorations helped you and inspire you as well. And finally, the last piece of this puzzle was the pencil. I knew that all of my students probably had access to a pencil with which they could draw, but what I didn't know is if they had other things to add color to their artwork, such as crayons or colored pencils or markers. And so it challenged me to push the limits of what the pencil could do, so that in the event that my students didn't have these things, that the pencil would be enough to add further interest to their artwork, so that they wouldn't really miss having those access to color. So this slide really goes into some of the explorations that I tried to create so that the pencil seemed like a more versatile material. So some of them are obvious, like lines, thick and thin lines. If the pencil has a very pointy tip, you can get super, super thin lines. If you dull down the tip of the pencil, you can get thicker lines. Another thing that the pencil is great for is value. You can get very dark values with the pencil. You can get very light values with the pencil. And it also, in exploring value, students can also experiment with different ways to hold the pencil by holding the pencil on the side and shading with it. Another aspect that sort of piggybacks off of value is the ability to smudge the pencil and to create with the smudges. And then also to use the eraser of the pencil in conjunction with the smudges to almost create some other type of interesting effects. And then lastly, actually there's two more, texture. I encourage students to use the copy paper and to put it on some interesting surfaces that they had access to either outside their house or inside their house, and to rub the pencil on top of the paper across those surfaces. And then that would also add interest to their to whatever they were creating. And then finally was this layering technique. And there was one day where I just kind of sat down with the pencil and I tried shading, and then on top of the shading I tried drawing lines and making different patterns. And it really inspired me to see, wow, a pencil is a pretty great tool. And you don't really need sometimes to think about color. So I hope these ideas were helpful to you. And I have a quick video where I'll sort of show you some of my explorations to give you some more further inspiration. Last but not least, I wanted to show you guys my there was marker on the other side too, but I just wanted to show you this one day. I just started going with the pencil and trying some different things, and I was able to get a lot of different looks with the pencil, and it really kind of was a breakthrough for me to see, hey, it's okay if my kids don't have colored options, because really there's so much you can do with a pencil. So I just kind of this was kind of one of those days where I didn't have my sketchbook open, but this was just a piece of paper that I was brainstorming on, and I just wanted to show you that, because this is something that we could sort of apply to other materials as well, just kind of exploring and experimenting and pushing it to the limits. And then I was able to use this. I showed you this earlier, but this is sort of a good example of using the dark and light values and the darker lines and the thinner lines, some of the thicker lines. This was another pop-up book that my older kids did, and this was on the Crocotac website. But what was kind of cool was, again, I was showing my students, you don't necessarily need to have color for this. And then this was kind of an example, this particular room, where I was showing them, where I was smudging the floor, creating a rug, using really thin lines, using dark layering. So this was just sort of kind of an example of putting that into practice. I hope this presentation was inspirational and that you'll be able to take some of these ideas back to your own classrooms.